Conventional wisdom has it that America was the victim of a sneak attack by the Japanese on December 7, 1941. The truth is that Roosevelt knew when and where the Japanese would strike. He kept that information from our military commanders in Hawaii because he knew that if Admiral Kimmel and General Short were alerted, they would make preparations. If the Japanese had known their attack was anticipated, they would not have made it. Roosevelt wanted them to attack American territory because he wanted America to enter into World War II. So did Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. In fact, we will show in this documentary that the Soviet Union and its Communist Party apparatus had extensive networks of control and agents provocateur in the United States government who were fully aware of the oncoming Japanese attack, even though elements within our own government were not. We bring you a special documentary interview with Thomas K. Kimmel, eldest living grandson of Admiral Kimmel. Welcome to the special documentary that you're about to see on these stations, and we're very grateful for the opportunity. For those of you who did not see our Pearl Harbor documentary on December 6th in its initial airing, we're welcoming back again our guest who is on that, who is in fact a Pearl Harbor scholar, former FBI agent and eldest grandson of Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor during the attack of December 7th, 1941. Tom comes to us from a distinguished family of scholars and government servants dedicated to protecting America. And a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, Tom has served on 3 warships during the Vietnam War and attended the John Marshall Law School prior to joining the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1973, where he continued to serve for about 25 or 6 years. And he has investigated organized crime. He has involved himself in various parts of the country, in various offices of the Bureau. Upon retiring from the FBI, he served as a consultant to the Bureau, addressing major spy scandals in the FBI and CIA, among other things. Welcome back to this program, this special Tom K. Kimmel.
Rick, thank you. As always, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. The pleasure is ours. Today, we're going to review some of the tragedies of World War II and the debacle that it turned out to be in terms of victory in much of the world for the Soviet Union and Communist China, of course, under Mao Zedong, how that happened, how it was made possible. Even as we discussed in a previous documentary, how did Pearl Harbor happen? Well, we find a common thread in all of this, I guess, Tom, and it does seem to me, to the casual observer, to look at the entire picture, actually going back to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and through the 20s, Walter Duranty, the New York Times reporter who failed to see anything wrong under Stalin's regime, to the election of Roosevelt in 1933 when he assumed office, and what happened between 1933, the official recognition of Soviet Russia, right up through the war years and beyond, Truman and Eisenhower and so forth, was an interesting story of Soviet espionage in the United States. And we'll refer to a number of books, a number of papers that have been written to document that espionage. But I almost don't know where to begin with you. You as a former FBI agent are an investigator, and you have read, I guess, just about every treatise imaginable on Pearl Harbor and World War II largely, haven't you?
Well, that's certainly a little bit of an overstatement, but I've read an awful lot about this, having been my favorite subject now since I was a teenager. And I'm no longer a teenager. I'm looking hard at 66 here, coming up soon. Interesting idea, parlaying off of what the Joint Congressional Committee tried to answer in 1946. How is it possible for Pearl Harbor to occur? Well, one of the strong possibilities of answering that question, how is it possible for Pearl Harbor to occur, couldn't even begin to be answered until 1995. And that incorporated revelations about espionage that were so successfully perpetrated by the Soviets against the United States. The credibility of those allegations was only really made manifest in 1995 and subsequent. And we're still grappling with the information that was finally made public in 1995. There was so much information, and the ramifications of it are so strong, we're still grappling with exactly what did that mean. But clearly it is part of the answer to the question, how is it possible for Pearl Harbor to occur? And in the FBI, in all of the intelligence agencies, certainly one of the key questions you have about any espionage matter, and the key question that you have to keep in mind all the time, it's an age-old question. It comes from the Romans, sui bono, who benefits? Who benefits from this activity? Once you try and figure out what happened. And I was intrigued, and maybe you can help me out with this. I was always intrigued by a quote that's attributed to President Roosevelt, but I'm not sure he actually said it. It's attributed to him. And the quote is, in politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way.
Yes.
When you see a rattlesnake poised to strike you, do not wait until he is struck before you crush him. Now, I don't know if President Roosevelt actually said that, but certainly many people think that he said it. It's attributed to him. If I could nail down exactly the source of that quotation, I'd be very grateful to you.
No, I think we can do that. We can do that because as far as I know, he most certainly did say it. And we know that Harry Hopkins, who was his point man, his top man during these years, also boasted about his involvement, you know, in the Soviet Union. And some of the things he said about the American public were actually quite revealing on what he again, is attributed to him, and that is tax and spend. You can elect and elect. The people are too darn dumb to understand in so many words. I think that's pretty close to what he was quoted as having said.
That's a little depressing to think of that. But.
Well, that's what he said. Now, It turned out Harry Hopkins was, I believe, identified in these subsequent investigations, the Venona intercepts in the 90s that were released, as a Soviet agent or someone in the government of Roosevelt that was actually working consciously for the Soviet effort. Can you verify that for us?
Well, at the very least, an unwitting dupe of the Soviets, maybe. But in order to tell that story, we really do have to make sure the audience understands what magic is. Because without that understanding, the rest of the story loses significance. So perhaps I better at least come up with this definition of magic, since it's so important to the Pearl Harbor story, and it's very important to the overall espionage aspects of the Pearl Harbor story, as I will hopefully make clear here soon. But magic was a code word, a secret American code word for the decoding of Japanese diplomatic and spy communications. Terribly important, the spy communications. These decoded Japanese spy communications and the diplomatic communications gave us, prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, indications of the place, time, reason, and deceit planned to cover the Pearl Harbor attack. Admiral Kimmel and General Short in Pearl Harbor, the head of the Navy and the head of the Army, respectively, in Pearl Harbor, had no magic of consequence. In sharp contrast to the head of the Army in the Philippines, General MacArthur, and the head of the Navy in the Philippines, the Commander-in-Chief of the Asiatic Fleet, Thomas Hart, they had magic. And, of course, the British had magic. What we are learning now through the revelations in the espionage aspects of the Pearl Harbor story is that the Soviets had at least had access to magic, and we'll get into that. We're finding out that the head of external security for the United States, William Donovan, the head of the Office of Strategic Services, the coordinator of information, he didn't have magic, amazingly enough. The head of internal security, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, he also did not have access to magic, as unbelievable as that might seem. Admiral Kimmel, Mr. Hoover, Wild Bill Donovan shared the same fate. They were out of the intelligence loop in that regard. Mr. Hoover resented it dramatically. The fact that the Soviets had access to magic is truly a remarkable story. We can continue with a breakdown of the information that was available from magic. It included probably primarily the reaction that the Japanese had to the famous American note of November 26, 1941, that was sent by the Secretary of State Cordell Hull. What we didn't realize at the time, and still are having trouble coming to grips with, is that that American note was written in the first instance by a Soviet spy, Harry Dexter White. It was written in response to a detailed plan from the Soviet NKVD. The importance of that American note is hard to overestimate. Our ambassador to Japan, Ambassador Joseph Grew, testified before the Army Pearl Harbor Board about that American note. After he testified, the Army Pearl Harbor Board styled that American note as the document that touched the button that started the war. That note was written in the first two instances by Harry Dexter White in response to a detailed plan that had a code name, a Soviet code name, called Operation Snow. Operation Snow was named in honor of Harry Dexter White. Snow as in white, white as in snow. In addition to the remarkable document that touched the button that started the war, we have 147 spy reports coming out of Hawaii, Manila, the Panama Canal, Seattle, Washington, of which 68 of these spy reports were involving Hawaii. 55 of them involved Manila, which probably should tell you about as much as you need to know, because those are the two spots that the Japanese attacked. The information from the 55 spy reports was immediately read by General MacArthur and Admiral Hart in the Philippines. None, let me say that again, none, not a single one of the 68 spy reports involving Hawaii, coming out of Hawaii by a specific Japanese spy whose stiff name was Morimura and whose real name was Yoshikawa. None of those 68 reports, even though they were readily available to American authorities in Washington, D.C., and in the Philippines, for that matter, none of those spy reports were made available to Admiral Kimmel or General Short in Hawaii or to the FBI. Amazingly, not made available to the FBI, even though the FBI had primary jurisdiction for counter-espionage in Hawaii at the time. Almost unbelievable. The spy reports continue. One of the more famous spy reports comes from the Director of Central Intelligence under Ronald Reagan, President Reagan. The Director of Central Intelligence was William Casey. William Casey was a member of the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. In 1988, William Casey, by himself apparently, wrote a book called The Secret War Against Hitler. On page 7 of that book appears this sentence: the British had sent word that a Japanese fleet was steaming east toward Hawaii. When I read that for the first time, I almost fell off my chair. Unfortunately, the Director of Central Intelligence, William Casey, deceased shortly after writing that book, and we were completely unable to follow up with that extraordinary statement until rather recently. In 2000, a book came to our notice, written by Richard Aldrich, called Intelligence in the War Against Japan, in which he quotes the former head of MI6, think of MI6 as the British CIA, the former MI6's chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee. The Joint Intelligence Committee was put together prior to America's entry into World War II and remained in charge of sorting out intelligence for the Allies all through the war. The chairman of that Intelligence Committee was Victor Cavendish Bentinck. Victor Cavendish Bentinck was quoted in 2000 as saying, "We, the British, and the Joint Intelligence Committee knew that the Japanese fleet had changed course by Friday, December 5th, 1941. I, Victor Cavendish Bentinck, remember presiding over a Joint Intelligence Committee meeting and being told that a Japanese fleet was sailing in the direction of Hawaii. And I asked at the time, have we informed our transatlantic brethren? And I received an affirmative reply." Interesting as this is, it is supported by a member of the Joint Intelligence Committee, a Sir Julian Ridsdale, who recalled, for purposes of the Aldrich's book in 2000, he recalled a Joint Intelligence Committee meeting at which radio silence of the Japanese was adopted by the Japanese and discussed as to its possible destinations of the emanating signals. Pearl Harbor was one of the targets thought most likely, and as a result, a warning telegram was dispatched to Washington. Sir Ridsdale met with Cavendish Bentinck and confirmed that a warning telegram had been dispatched to the United States. In addition to that, we have a Canadian, Merton Seymour, who filed an affidavit in 2001, as it was reported, that he was told by a Joseph Applediely, who was a staff member of the Canadian Department of National Defense for Air, informed Morton Seymour, who had a major responsibility for the training of pilots for the Canadians for World War II. He was informed that British military intelligence had informed Ottawa, which is the capital, that it was suspected that the Japanese would make a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 8th, 1941.
Yes.
And asked Merton Seymour what was the earliest date that the Canadians could hold a special meeting of the board of directors of the association. Now we continue with another Canadian, in this case, the former Prime Minister, as a matter of fact, the 14th Prime Minister of Canada. He was Prime Minister from 1963 to 1968, Lester B. Pearson, who in a letter to Morton Seymour said British military intelligence had informed Ottawa that the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor on December 8th, which, because of the international dateline, turned out to be December 7th. This information was given to Merton Seymour in a letter from the Canadian Prime Minister in 1972. As if that were not enough, the famous secretary to Winston Churchill's man at the Rockefeller Center, the famous spy Sir William Stevenson, who was a Canadian, his secretary, Grace Garner, came out with information to the effect that we, the British, we the Canadians, did know that they were going to attack, the Japanese were going to attack on December 7th. We, the Canadians, told London about this. We told the Americans about this. We had quite some considerable warning days in advance of the attack.
And he says we told the Americans about that.
Told the Americans about that.
That's the government of Roosevelt.
Now, granted, these are all after-the-fact testimonials, but nonetheless, they're not coming from the ragman. They're coming from people in prominent positions who, if it were not true, certainly shouldn't be saying things like that. Back to who benefits from all this? Well, if you think about it for a moment, who benefited from the Pearl Harbor attack? Well, Besides, theoretically, the Japanese benefiting from the Pearl Harbor attack. The big beneficiaries of the Pearl Harbor attack, of course, were the British and the Soviets. So exploring what the Soviets, what their involvement might be, was extremely difficult because we were so closely tied to the Soviet effort that it appeared that the Soviets could do nothing wrong. There's a good reason for that. The Soviets were suffering the brunt of the Wehrmacht, the German army. They were doing most of the fighting. They were doing more of the fighting than the British were, certainly doing more of the fighting than we were doing. So they had good reason for wanting as much help as they could get. And they were particularly well adept through history, inclination, training at espionage. And we really didn't find this out publicly until 1995, when the famous Venona materials were finally made public.
Yes.
Even though the Venona materials had been known to American intelligence for decades, they were not made public until 1995. We're still trying to sort this out. Venona was a code word, a secret American code word for the secret decoding of Soviet spy cables sent from establishments in the United States, specifically New York, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco, to Moscow Center from 1939 to 1948. The Venona cables encompassed about 2,900 cables that we actually broke into. That only represented maybe 10% of the total take. So from only 10% of the total take that we were able to break into, we were able to identify, unbelievably enough, 349 mostly American spies that had been corrupted by the Soviets and were working for the Soviet war effort. Of these 349 mostly American spies that were identified through Venona, that program, slightly less than half, 171, were identified by their true name. Slightly more than half, 179, 178, were identified by their cover name, only their cover name. And that remains true today. And of course, from the Pearl Harbor perspective, what makes this so intriguing is that a couple of the most prominent spies, the most successful of the Soviet spies, led directly to the Pearl Harbor attack, have a big part to play in the Pearl Harbor story. I might start by saying that on November 5th, at the request of the President of the United States, the head of the Navy, Admiral Stark, and the head of the Army, General Marshall, were asked to provide the President with their best thinking as to when or how the American government should deal with the Japanese threat. Specifically, should they offer to the Japanese an ultimatum? And if we had to go to war with the Japanese, when should we do it? Should we do it now, or should we delay it as long as we can? If we can delay it, for how long should we delay it? This matter was presented to the head of the Navy and the head of the Army by the President of the United States himself. On November 5th, in a joint memorandum signed by the head of the Navy, Admiral Stark, and the head of the Army, General Marshall, they presented to Roosevelt that the war between the United States and Japan should be avoided while building up defensive forces in the Far East until such time as Japan might attack us. At least 3 months, the head of the Army and the head of the Navy was calling for in order to prepare the armed forces. And they specifically recommended that no ultimatum be issued to Japan. This was on November 5th in a joint memorandum. It's available on the public record. Interestingly enough, a copy of that memorandum was sent to Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii, and he received it on November 20th, 1941. Admiral Kimmel receives a memorandum signed by the head of the Army and the head of the Navy, specifically going to the President of the United States, strongly recommending that no ultimatum be sent to Japan. This is on November 20th when Kimmel gets it. It was actually sent to him on November 14th. Mm-hmm. On November 26th, in spite of that memorandum, an ultimatum was indeed sent to Japan. There's some dispute as to whether it was an ultimatum or a sincere effort to avoid war. If you don't want to call it an ultimatum, you have to call it an American note. But you're really splitting hairs here, because we knew from secret reading of the Japanese codes, we knew their response to this American note, and they determined it to be an ultimatum. They said it was an ultimatum, worse than an ultimatum. They said it was a humiliating proposal. Under no circumstances could they use it as a basis for further negotiations. Things were now automatically going to happen. A formal response would be sent to this American note, if you prefer, and it would be delivered at a time to be announced subsequently. Once again, this document was later styled by the Army Pearl Harbor Board as the document that touched the button that started the war. Interestingly enough, Churchill had a response to the American note of November 26, 1941, the Secretary of State Cordell Hull's note. Churchill himself was terribly surprised, and he said when he read the note, it not only met our wishes, in other words, the United Kingdom's wishes, and those of the associated governments, mainly the Dutch, but indeed went beyond anything we, the British, ventured to ask of the United States.
Wow, that's quite an observation.
So the question is why? You'll certainly note that Stalin was under no such illusions. He knew precisely why this thing was being presented.
Yes.
The Venona project had several iterations of code names prior to settling on Venona. Mm-hmm. One of them was called Bride. That was one of the initial ones. In the Bride take, there are very specific broken Russian spy cables identifying Harry Dexter White as a spy. There isn't any question that he was a Soviet spy. Harry Dexter White was the #2 man in the Department of Treasury. Mm-hmm. He was the fair-haired boy of the Department of Treasury. He was the fair-haired boy of the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau. Henry Morgenthau was a bit of a hawk when it came to the Japanese. Morgenthau was not considered overly bright. Harry Dexter White was considered extraordinarily bright. He graduated from Columbia University, took a master's degree at Stanford, PhD at Harvard, or the other way around. I can't quite remember right now, but Stanford, Harvard, and Columbia were in his resume. And indeed, he was a very bright fellow. He had been recruited as a Soviet spy by a remarkably successful illegals officer by the name of Ikshaak Akhmerov in the 1930s, along with dozens of other spies. Akhmerov is considered a poster child in the Intelligence Committee on how to do it, how to corrupt and develop spies. And he did it with a remarkable success in the 1930s when he developed Harry Dexter White.
Now, was this man actually in America, or was he in the Soviet Union at this time?
Akhmerov?
Yes.
Akhmerov was an illegals officer. That means he was here in this country illegally, under a cover. Mm-hmm. These are the true spies in the world of espionage.
So he was, this man Akhmerov, he was basically the one who was tutoring, what you're saying is tutoring White?
He was developing the spy, determining whether or not the individual that they were targeting was worthy of development, and then actually making the development.
And do you recall, Tom, what years did Harry Dexter White begin serving as assistant in the Secretary and then Secretary of the Treasury?
Well, he was never Secretary of the Treasury. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He was
under Roosevelt.
Under Roosevelt. Actually,
1942, was it?
Well, he comes in almost immediately with the New Deal.
Okay.
And that's how all of these guys came in under the New Deal.
Naturally.
And eventually gravitated over to the Treasury Department. All of this done, of course, in the early 1930s as young, aspiring, bright New Deal Democrats. And they made a name for themselves. They were identified as the young, bright people that they were. They just also happened to be communists and under Soviet influence and control.
That's interesting because another quote attributed to FDR was that some of his best friends were communists.
Indeed, and in fairness, President Roosevelt certainly was not the only one taken in by Stalin's efforts. It was just amazing how completely taken in the Roosevelt administration seemed to be. Even Harry Truman, for the longest time, had great difficulty trying to grapple with the idea that President Roosevelt could have been so taken in by the conspiracy of Joseph Stalin. Stalin was paving the way for World War III. It was going to be Russia against the United States. There doesn't seem to be much doubt about that.
Well, now, let me just interject again here before we get back to this espionage ring in the United States. What you say, I guess, is definitely what I have read and what I have observed in the annals of history, particularly pursuant to the 1933 ascendancy of the Roosevelt administration. And one of its first diplomatic things was overtures was to extend diplomatic recognition to Stalin's regime in Russia. And what that meant was that we would then allow for the building up of this regime at a time when it was in a state of collapse. I mean, let's face it, the Soviet communist system was a total morass of failure. It was a despotic system that could not withstand or stand on its own feet. So Roosevelt had to know what he was doing, the implications of what he was doing in extending diplomatic recognition to Stalin and his henchmen. And this is after the murder of millions and millions of kulaks and others killed under his regime.
Well, I think Roosevelt's response was, they're better off, the Russians are better off under Stalin than they were under the Tsar.
No, is that what he said?
that was the rationale for proceeding that way. But back to the revelation that the Soviets were so successful in their plan, getting us involved in World War II. This is not just something that I have dreamed up. This is the Soviets themselves who have described this. Vladimir Karpov, a member of the Soviet military intelligence, was writing in an independent military review, a trade magazine in Moscow. He wrote in 2002 that Harry Dexter White was acting in accordance with a design initiated by this Akhmerov and a junior NKVD officer at the time, another fellow by the name of Pavlov, who was dispatched to go meet Harry Dexter White and initiate this Operation Snow. The essence of Operation Snow was to provoke the war between Japan and the United States to ensure the security of the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
The idea simply is the worst thing that can happen to the Russians, they're fighting the Germans on the one side. The last thing they want to do is to fight the Japanese at the same time on the other side.
That's
and
right.
they are going to do what they can do to avoid that.
That would have been their death knell.
Who can blame them? Of course they're going to do what they can do to avoid that. Now, this is the same idea applies to the British. The British obviously had their hands full fighting the Germans, and the unthinkable scenario was for the British to not only have to fight the Germans, but to have to fight the Japanese without the United States. This is what Churchill said was the unthinkable scenario. It's bad enough we, the British, have to fight the Germans, but to fight the Germans and the Japanese without the United States, unthinkable was his thought. So clearly,
These were his thoughts.
he's got the same idea in mind as Stalin does. It's just Stalin is better positioned to do something about it. And the way he goes about it is fascinating. The reason we know so much about it is because the fellow who was eventually picked to make the approach on Harry Dexter White, to suggest to Harry Dexter White what the Soviets wanted the American position to be vis-a-vis the Japanese, the fellow who was doing that was alive until rather recently. I think he deceased a year, maybe a year and a half ago, Vitaly Pavlov. So he explains his meeting with Harry Dexter White. The meeting took place in May of 1941. It took place at the old Ebbets Grill in Washington, D.C., which still exists today, although it's slightly in a different location, about a block away from where it used to be. But he meets Harry Dexter White in 1941. This is his description of it. And he is dispatched there because Soviet intelligence officers from the NKVD are much senior to Pavlov, have come up with the plan. And the plan was originally developed by Boris Bykov, who was the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence illegal in New York, who came up with the idea of why can't we use Akhmerov's spies from the 1930s, who are now situated in various positions of influence in the American government. Well, they think that's a rather grand idea. Another Soviet intelligence officer by the name of Ovyakimian, he comes up specifically with, why don't we use Harry Dexter White? And they come up with this idea in January of 1941, which just happens to be the very time that my grandfather is being put in position of the Pacific Fleet. So even before my grandfather takes over, the Soviets have initiated this program to influence the American position to hopefully wind up with war with Japan. Right. And Japan not attacking the Soviet Union.
Now, this whole thing is a Soviet strategy. What you're saying is because Japan was a natural enemy of the Soviet Union, and had Japan taken on that responsibility of war with the Soviets, England is in the middle of it, Hitler's on the other side, this would have made for a very interesting situation that would have obviously eliminated the possibility that Japan would attack the United States. Japan was so preoccupied in Asia, the invasion of China, and the Soviet antipathy that was there. So they were really brilliant strategists, what these Soviet criminals were doing, and then the puppets in Washington were doing.
Well, it becomes clear when Admiral Kimmel gives a radio interview a day and a half before the Pearl Harbor attack, in which the reporter asks Admiral Kimmel, are the Japanese going to attack the United States? Not Pearl Harbor, they're going to attack the United States. Right. And Admiral Kimmel says they're not going to attack the United States because the Germans have had to go into winter quarters outside of Moscow. And the Japanese are not stupid enough to attack the United States while Russia is still a threat.
That's a very
This is Admiral Kimmel's thinking.
He was right,
day and a
ahead
half
of his time.
Before the attack. That's his thinking. But of course, Admiral Kimmel has no idea of this type of espionage that's going on. To finish the development of the story, the director of foreign intelligence back in Moscow, Pavel Fitton, the head of the NKVD, Foreign Intelligence, writes what they call a spravka, which is a memo. That's a Russian term for a memo of plan of action. And the plan of action involves, first of all, keeping it secret. In order to do that, they have to assassinate some people within the NKVD that they're worried about, and they proceed to do that. So they clear that up. And then they set up the plan, and they get Beria, the head of the NKVD, and Stalin to approve the plan on a priority basis. And of course, it's on a priority basis because the Soviets are still hip deep in the Weimar coming to Moscow. At any rate, the plan now is to dispatch Vitaly Pavlov to Washington to meet with Harry Dexter White. And they meet. And Vitaly Pavlov gives Harry Dexter White his instructions, or at least suggestions, what they hope, the Soviets hope, will be the American position, diplomacy vis-a-vis Japan. And of course, it's important to recognize here that Harry Dexter White is not in the State Department, he's in the Treasury Department. So there's a bit of an anomaly there, but it's explained simply by the fact that Roosevelt had accepted great influence in foreign policy from the Treasury Department, specifically from Morgenthau, who was a very close personal friend of Morgenthau, and vice versa. At any rate, Pavlov, he makes his pitch to Harry Dexter White in May of 1941. And then in June of 1941, Harry Dexter White writes his first draft of what will eventually turn out to be the American Note of November 26, 1941. And I would invite anyone, and I use this when I give my PowerPoint presentations, I throw the pertinent part of the original June 6th draft, which contains the all-important statement to ensure that the Japanese completely withdraw from China. They've been fighting a war in China for 4 years, and we're telling them they have to get out of China and support the Chiang Kai-shek. It's what we've told them to do. And of course, the Soviets knew that there's no way in the world the Japanese were going to accept that.
No, I mean, that's like telling the United States, you know, what to do with regard to anywhere else in the world.
Exactly.
So, I mean, here is the United States acting, following the Wilson administration's philosophy of a global policeman now, that we were going to tell the world basically what we thought was right and wrong, and Japan was the perfect opportunity to do this.
Indeed it was. Now, the first iteration of this is in June of 1941 by Harry Dexter White.
Yeah.
The second iteration is in November 17th of 1941, and that's actually contained in the Joint Congressional Committee report, the second draft. Of course, it isn't identified as a second draft. It is a letter from Morgenthau to the President, a copy to the Secretary of State. What the Secretary of Treasury is recommending be the position vis-a-vis Japan. It's the same thing as the first iteration written by Harry Dexter White. Harry Dexter White writes this Morgenthau memo to Cordell Hull. The reason we know he wrote that, and the only reason we know it, is because his initials, HDW, are on that memorandum. During the entire Joint Congressional Committee investigation, Harry Dexter White's name is not mentioned at all. You can go through all 30,000 pages of that, and you will not find Harry Dexter White mentioned in any way, with the one exception, his initials, HDW, appear on that memo. And of course, it isn't until much later we figured out, my goodness, this man was a spy working for the Soviets at the time he wrote this draft, and his key phrases in his draft turn up in the almost identical language in the eventual November 26, 1941, American note from Cordell Hull to the Japanese, which was the document that touched the button that started the war. And of course, one of the reasons that Pearl Harbor is so sensitive today is the administration doesn't want to make any kind of an admission that that's the case. That's the case. Now, the Soviet espionage doesn't even begin to end with the Harry Dexter White initiative.
Oh, that's for sure.
We continue on with the NKVD in China. The NKVD actually develops a source who is in charge of security for Chiang Kai-shek. They have another source, an American assistant to President Roosevelt, Launchlin Curie, who's in charge of the American effort in China. He's a Soviet source. We find out from Launchlin Curie, who once again appears in some half a dozen to a dozen of these Venona intercepts, yes. So there isn't any doubt at all that he's a Soviet spy as well. We have a memorandum from him to the President of the United States talking about providing Chiang Kai-shek with our secret Air Force in China prior to Pearl Harbor with plans to bomb Japan. This is all prior to Pearl Harbor.
Say this again now? Wait a minute now. American plans to bomb Japan?
We have American plans to bomb Japan, which has been revealed in a very recent book. As a matter of fact, it was a subject of a vignette on 2020. No less an authority than Barbara Walters was revealing the story about how we had had a plan signed off on by President Roosevelt. We got the memo with Roosevelt, his approving the plan, setting out. Of course, it's a contingency plan. Mm-hmm. It's a contingency plan because Pearl Harbor happened before we could implement the plan.
Just in case. Though.
All of this was going to be a
Just
secret,
in
you
case.
see. We were going to bomb Japan.
From China.
From China.
All right.
But, of course, it was all going to be done covertly.
Naturally.
The United States wasn't going to have its fingerprints on this bombing
now,
of Japan.
was this through this OSS ring, the Operation of Strategic Services?
This is through Claire Chennault, this famous Flying Tigers. This was the all-volunteer outfit. But it was all to be done, not in a military context, but in a diplomatic context, covertly, a classic covert operation with great deniability, that all of this was going to be China in their war effort against Japan, and the United States, their fingerprints were not going to be on this. All right?
Okay.
So this is going on at the same time that Harry Dexter White is being approached, and he is trying to sway the position of the United States government vis-a-vis Japan to the benefit of the Soviet Union. At the same time, we are beefing up China further, sticking it to the Japanese, goading the Japanese, and giving them yet another reason why they might want to make a preemptory strike, because they're finding out our plans to make a preemptory strike against them, all right, through Launchlin Curie, another Soviet spy. Now, in addition to that, of course, we have the famous Richard Sorge spy ring in Japan. This is the third leg of this
tripod,
marvelously successful effort to ensure that Japan attacks the United States and doesn't attack the Russians.
Right, exactly.
And of course, they are terribly successful in that regard. A way we found out that they were so successful through Sorge is fascinating. Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, himself an intelligence officer, famously has been quoted as saying that Sorge was the man whom he regarded as the most formidable spy in history. And recalling a recent 2005 book, diary, from the head of the director of counter-espionage for MI5. MI5 is roughly the British FBI. British FBI.
MI6, of course, is the CIA's equivalent.
Guy Liddell, throughout the entire war, was the director of counter-espionage for MI5. He wrote a diary. Who knew? Well, Nigel West, kind of a official historian for MI5, he knew, and in 2005 published the diary. This is 2005. In 2005, he's quoting Guy Liddell, who makes a diary entry in January of 1943, in which he says, according to a Japanese BJ, BJ was British for Black Jumbo, which is British for magic.
Operation
specifically
magic?
Japanese magic.
Right, right.
All right. In other words, the British had intercepted a Japanese dispatch, decoded it, and it said that Dr. Richard Sorge's spy ring in Japan consisted of 246 members, 9 of whom were Soviet citizens.
Unbelievable.
Completely unbelievable. But it doesn't end there. Of course, we have the famous comment that Churchill made about there are many kinds of maneuvers in war, but that only take place on the battlefield. But he was most intrigued by the maneuver which brings an ally into the field, and he considered that to be at least as serviceable as winning a great victory. Now, this is Churchill who said that, but Stalin must have been snickering when he heard it, because Stalin was the master at maneuvering and bringing an ally into the field covertly.
Very skilled at that, yes.
Very skilled at that.
You know, what you're saying now, I don't want to interrupt your flow because this is quite a learning experience for our audience, but when you're done, several questions come to mind that need to be addressed. So you continue until you're done with that.
Well, we know the reaction through decoding of these Japanese communications.
Yes,
we know the reactions the Japanese had to this document that touched the button that started the war, that was written in the first 2 iterations by a Soviet spy. Well, not only do we know it, Stalin knows it because Stalin has access to this material.
Unbelievable.
There were 4 messages specifically in the Purple Code that we had broken through our good efforts at counter-espionage.
Yes.
We were reading these messages even before the Japanese were reading the messages. We knew their response. We knew that they considered the November 26, 1941
Yes.
American note that was written in the first instance, 2 instances by a Soviet spy. We knew that they considered that to be a humiliating proposal that was quite unexpected, extremely regrettable. The imperial government can by no means use it as a basis for negotiations. The negotiations will be de facto ruptured. This is inevitable. That's just one of the Japanese reaction messages, as I call them.
But you know what intrigues me here now? Let me just say this now. The person today, young people and anybody of any age who's been so inculcated with Hollywood's version of history and the New York Times and all of the other media and how they've rewritten history, they say, so what? You know, who cares what the Japanese think? You know, just like who cares what Iraqis think or Iranians think of the United States? You know, might makes right, and that's all that counts. But you see, you have to put brain over brawn for a moment and ask yourself, if in fact all of this is now documented as it is, coming from the official government declassified files, then that alters the whole equation here, because the Japanese would never have killed Americans, never have taken Americans, never have bombed Pearl Harbor, and there would have been no, you know, Bataan Death March. There would have been none of these things had the Soviet plan not succeeded.
Well, interestingly enough, your thought in that matter is echoed by none other than George C. Marshall.
Oh my, of all people.
Well, George C. Marshall, he made it very clear that if indeed President Roosevelt had followed his advice, George C. Marshall's advice,
the man with the photographic memory,
and delayed this ultimatum to the Japanese, if he had delayed it for 3 months, well, first of all, the weather conditions would no longer have been favorable for a Japanese strike 3 months out from December. Right. But more importantly, 3 months out from December, the whole situation with the Weimar in Moscow had changed, and it became much clearer that the Germans had a big problem in Moscow by an inability to end the situation as they had hoped. And now the Japanese would have had to take great notice of that and say, holy smokes, is it wise for us to be attacking south when clearly we still have this big problem to the north because the Soviets have not been defeated like we thought they were in November. Now it's 3 months out from there. Now we're talking January and February. It's now very clear that at the best, the Germans are not going to take Moscow for quite a while. So you still have this continuing threat. This is George Marshall's reasoning here. So if they had delayed it for 3 months and not sent that ultimatum at the time, but to string them along, give them what they had called a modus vivendi, in other words, a time for peace, a break in the action where both sides agree not to do anything for a little while. And that was the other proposal. The big question was, are we going to send this ultimatum or are we going to send this modus vivendi, this time for peace, where we both agree that we're not going to take any overt action for 3 months. We all agree to that. Well, since they decided to go with the ultimatum, the Japanese, who were already steaming towards Hawaii, they were steaming towards Hawaii, of course, before November 26th. They started the day before. With instructions, I might add, that at any time, if the United States had relented from their position and offered the modus vivendi, for example, that the strike force was to turn around and go back to Tokyo. But because that didn't happen, they went ahead with the attack. This is George C. Marshall talking. This is not something I'm making up. So he was very much in tune with that as well. And of course, the real problem is Admiral Kimmel has no idea that we have even issued this ultimatum to the Japanese.
He was totally left in the dark.
He'd been told just the opposite. He had been told that the head of the Army, the head of the Navy were recommending the President don't do that. He had no reason to believe that the President would ignore the head of the Army and the head of the Navy and go ahead and issue the ultimatum. But of course, it was done.
We're just talking about the Asian theater, the Pacific theater.
Right.
We haven't even explored the effect of Soviet plans vis-a-vis the Roosevelt administration in Europe, where, as you know, General Patton was very disturbed by much of what he saw under General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, particularly the fact that the plans, as you know, were to take Berlin, that is, the Americans to take Berlin once it fell, rather than the Soviet Union. It just so happened that Uncle Joe Stalin was right there, ready to take Berlin, and he did. And how did it happen? We talked about it in the World War II documentary that I did last year. It's just amazing how the United States policy, even Roosevelt's policy, was specific that America would take Berlin, and 17 months later it did just the opposite. It let the Soviets move in, changing the whole landscape, letting the Soviets go into Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and just take over everything. Even the American servicemen who were supposed to participate in a liberation parade, a military parade in Czechoslovakia, had to ask the Soviets first for permission to do that. So, you know, it was like a tragedy on the Eastern Front, it was a tragedy on the Western Front, in Asia and in Europe, and all of this was proclaimed as a victory over tyranny.
You have to ask yourself, how was Stalin able to do all of this? Well, he was able to do it because he knew what we, the United States and the British, were doing. He had the resources, the spies in place to know virtually our every move. Interestingly enough, with this Harry Dexter White, to take it one step further, in 1939, Whittaker Chambers, an admitted Soviet spy, tried to go to President Roosevelt.
He confessed he was a Soviet.
Whittaker Chambers was a handler, a courier for these Soviet spies.
Right.
As a consequence, he knew an awful lot about who they were and what they were doing.
Quite a bit, yes.
A whole lot more than the Soviets wanted him to know, but they didn't have any choice. Whittaker Chambers suddenly got religion and decided, I can't do this, mainly as a result of the Soviets making their pact with Hitler. Okay, this is what turned him around. Yeah. At any rate, he tries to go to President Roosevelt to blow the whistle on the spies.
Wow.
President Roosevelt refers him to Adolph Burl. Adolph Burl is the Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence. This is in 1939. A journalist by the name of Don Isaac Levine goes with Whittaker Chambers, and Don Isaac Levine go to see Adolph Burl. And they write notes as to what the meeting was all about. Burl writes notes. Whittaker Chambers lays out all these spies. I forget the number, some 30 or 40 spies, to include Launchlin Curie and Harry Dexter White. This is in 1939. Isaac Don Levine writes his own minutes of the meeting. Both of these minutes of the meeting are available. You can actually get them online. Here's the guy who eventually is dispatched by the Soviets to write the document that touches the button that starts the war. He is identified as a Soviet spy by a Soviet spy, Whittaker Chambers, who writes all about this in a marvelous autobiography, which is considered a classic autobiography called Witness. I don't know if you remember that one.
Oh, I do. I certainly do, yes.
But all of this goes nowhere. And the question is, when is this exactly referred to the FBI for action? And there's great mystery as to when exactly it is referred, depending on who you're talking to. Eventually, Whittaker Chambers goes to the FBI. In 1945, the war is now over. So the big issue is, what do we do with Harry Dexter White?
Give him a promotion.
That's exactly what we do to him. Harry Dexter White is a financial genius. He comes up with the idea of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So what does Truman do? Truman appoints him to be the first head of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank.
Naturally.
J. Edgar Hoover, by now, has figured out that Harry Dexter White was a Soviet spy.
Figured it out, huh?
He sends a memorandum over to Truman saying, this man's a Soviet spy. Well, why are you appointing him to be head of the World Bank?
That's why.
Well, this information is leaked out somehow. I don't know who leaks it out, but it's leaked out and it becomes a big political brouhaha. Truman now is trapped. Truman decides, well, I got to go public with this. I'm going to explain that the reason I have nominated him to be the head of the International Monetary Fund, even though he's suspected of being a spy, is because the FBI requested that I do this so they could continue their investigation and not make Harry Dexter White suspicious, you see. Well, Hoover gets a hold of that and says that is nonsense, and he goes public saying, we never said anything like that. We specifically said you should fire Harry Dexter White. So how do you like that?
Again, this is very interesting because one of the questions I'd like to interject right now at this point for you, Tom Kimmel, is why in the world would the Treasury Department be one of the first, other than the Agriculture Department, where the Soviet communists would want to penetrate?
Because they could get there. And of course, we're not just talking about Harry Dexter White. Venona identifies 11 spies.
11 spies, yeah.
11 spies
Treasury.
In Treasury, yeah. 11 in Treasury.
Yes.
Many more in the other departments. But it's not just Harry Dexter White. It's several of them, and they're feeding off of each other. They are promoting each other, making recommendations for promotion to each other.
In addition to that, isn't there a real Soviet agenda here in the Treasury Department? In 1942, it was Harry Dexter White who advised that we take our gold mining equipment that we had in the United States for mining gold, gold was real money then, okay, and give it to the Soviet Union as part of Lend-Lease.
Virtually every decision that they made, certainly that Harry Dexter White had his fingerprints on, was to the benefit of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and here's what, let me just interject this here, because another FBI man, Dan Smoot, had years ago written about this very subject, and he mentioned 1934 was a very key year. As you probably know from reading your history, Roosevelt in Congress took American citizens off of the gold standard, making it illegal for them to own gold coins or bullion, but foreigners, through their governments and central banks, could continue to redeem their papers in gold by selling them to the United States Treasury for gold bullion at the Treasury fixed price of $35 an ounce. And then he goes on, Tom, to talk about the power of control over and self-protection against ruinous fiscal policies of the Roosevelt administration and the American government was taken away from American citizens and transferred to foreigners, particularly at this time the Soviet Union. Now imagine the advantage of having gold mining equipment given to the Soviet Union, our Uncle Joe ally during the World War II era, 1942, and what it would do to us in the future in terms of currency, in terms of our economy. Well, this too was a communist Marxist plan. How do you destroy an economy? How do you subjugate it if not through monetary policy? So I can see the hand of Stalin. I can see the hand of Soviet communism involved in the Treasury very, very much so here.
Well, of course, they're a huge player. The world capitalist economy revolves around the Treasury. The Treasury, if you recall, was making a recommendation to turn Germany into an agrarian community, which probably would have gained the imprimatur of President Roosevelt. It was a little bit more than Truman was willing to promote, so it died under the Truman administration.
That was the infamous Morgenthau Plan?
Morgenthau Plan, yeah.
Who was the boss of White?
Right, he was the Secretary of Treasury, and the number 2 man was Harry Dexter White.
Now that's important. Let me stop you again here, okay? Because to turn Germany into an agrarian society from what? From a highly industrialized society. As you know, German industry and ingenuity was definitely in competition with the British and others in Europe all through those ages.
Well, indeed. Of course, this plan eventually went nowhere,
right.
Thanks, I guess, in large measure to receiving such a cool reception from President Truman. President Truman let that one go. But he still had the terrible problem of what to do with the revelations from Venona. Truman realized that most of this was going to fall off on the Democratic Party, and he tried best at damage control. And of course, the more he tried, the bigger issue he gave to the Republicans in this regard. The Republicans jumped all over the issue, mainly just because of political considerations. But nonetheless, Truman had this horrible situation on his hands when we had a bunch of former Soviet intelligence officers and former Soviet spies come forward at the end of the war and explain just how badly we had been infiltrated. Specifically, I'm talking about Elizabeth Bentley. She came forward with her statement, a very bright lady who laid out all of the Soviet cells that she had anything to do with, which were substantial. This went directly into the area of stealing the secrets of the atomic bomb. That's a pretty well described initiative now, but that stuff in 1945 was all being revealed secretly as a result of the Venona program. A code clerk came out of Canada by the name of Gusenko. In the intelligence community, many believe that this was the most important of all of the spies who came to the United States, because Gusenko's information was unassailable, as he explained the success that the Soviets were having in corrupting not only Americans, but Canadians as well. Gusenko comes forward. The head of the Communist Party USA, Budens, he comes forward.
Budens.
Yeah, we got Budens, we got Gusenko, we got Bentley. We've had Whittaker Chambers since 1939. All of these people are coming forward. We have identified, of course, Harry Dexter White and Launchlin Curie without anybody being able to counter that. And yet, we're still keeping this stuff secret. It was secret from the American public until 1995. The program lasted, Venona now, lasted until 1980, when the United States eventually said, we're exhausted. We've done the best we can to identify these hundreds of spies, but now we think it's bad money after good, so we're going to stop. In the UK, they kept it going. They're still trying to identify people in the UK. But in 1995, eventually, sort of by accident, we made it public. And there were still people who were representing that President Truman was never made aware of Venona, which is almost unbelievable that they would still advance such a theory as that.
Well, listen, we still have people that say Roosevelt didn't know about Pearl Harbor either until it happened. So, you know, that's no wonder. But let me also interject here now the question, the second question I wanted to ask you, which was, where was the Congress in all of this? Can I partially answer that myself by suggesting in the 1940s, you had a congressman from Texas, you had a Congressman Martin Dies, I'm sure you've heard of, who was interested in fighting all fifth columnists. He was interested in exposing Nazi agents, but more particularly the growing communist threat in the United States. And Roosevelt actually had used the IRS, among other instruments of the government, to punish him, to try to knock him out of commission. Now, that came from the Roosevelt administration. In the 1950s, Senator McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, came along, and to this day, there are people who still think that everything he had was just fudged and it was just made up. The hundreds of people in the State Department who are security risks, communists, card carriers or not. And the fact of the matter is, as we have shown in that documentary on World War II, Venona reveals, in fact, widespread Soviet agents in these governments during Roosevelt and still in Truman's administration. Now, others have said, like Dr. Smoot, have said the FBI files at the time did indicate that this was the case, but the Justice Department later, under Eisenhower as well, when McCarthy was really getting going with the Republican Revolution, would not allow, Attorney General Brownell would not allow those files to be opened and investigations of the FBI to be pursued. So McCarthy was depending basically on all that he had, and he didn't have as much as he needed with the press attacking him and others attacking him, because he was starting to step on toes, on powerful toes in the government. You see, so this vilification process that took place, the so-called dark days, the witch hunt era, actually was not a witch hunt at all. You come right down to it. Now we can see that. But this is years after the fact, Tom.
Well, if McCarthy had had Venona to back him up, he probably would have been elected president of the United States, as was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon owes his great publicity.
The pumpkin papers.
Well, of course, that's
Alger
Whittaker
Hiss,
Chambers.
Alger Hiss's exposures. And so forth.
Nixon convicts Alger Hiss.
Yes.
Because of Venona. Not that they could use that information in court, but of course that they were able to continue to pursue it because of Venona. They knew absolutely that Alger Hiss was guilty.
Yes.
So they were able to pursue it. Nixon, to his everlasting credit, kept Venona secret. But of course this put him in the national limelight, which eventually resulted in him becoming president of the United States.
Well, Hiss had perjured himself, right?
Hiss was eventually, and that the only thing he was convicted of was perjury. And of course, that's a long, tortured story as to how Hiss.
That's another story.
He's convicted. It's overturned. They try him again. He's eventually convicted. He denies it to the end. The interesting thing about it, as is so clear from the autobiography of Whittaker Chambers, is Whittaker Chambers' best friend was Alger Hiss. They went back forever. The wives knew each other. They. It's amazing.
Intimate relations.
It's amazing that Hiss could deny and deny the perfectly obvious. But because he was such a revered figure, he was able to get away with it until the Pumpkin Papers.
No.
The Pumpkin Papers did it because Alger Hiss's cursive script was on the Pumpkin Papers. And all of a sudden, it was a little tough for him to deny that he didn't know Whittaker Chambers anymore.
It was a little bit difficult, wasn't it? Now, that answers my question about the destruction of a movement in Congress, the investigation by the Congress into all of this espionage. But what about the media, in your opinion or your view? What about the media in this country, how it was so influenced, it seemed, so partisan in its support of this idea that there was no Soviet apparatus in the United States and it was exaggerated and so forth. New York Times, you know, going back to Walter Duranty and then later with Herbert Matthews in Cuba and all of that, the Washington Post. What are your thoughts about that? Did this extend this apparatus into the media as well? Or?
Well, it certainly did. And if you're going to go along with Whittaker Chambers, he'd identified several people associated in the media as under the influence, or at least the specter of the Soviets, whether they're unwitting dupes or true believers. They certainly did not leave anything to chance in that regard. Enormously effective. And of course, we still have over half of these spies only identified by code name, so we don't know who they were. And then they only got the 349 spies from 10% of the take that they actually had.
Wow. So it's much vaster than we were led to believe.
Yeah, the real lesson to be learned is you have to be on guard for that kind of thing. Here we have this unbelievable situation in Fort Hood, Texas. Who knows how this is going to play out?
Let me ask you this now. As far as the Soviet apparatus in the United States is concerned, just what we know from what you've told us today, and I know you're only scratching the surface on this documentary about the influence and control that the party had, and the fact that the Communist Party there had owed its loyalty not to individual communist cells, but in fact to the Soviet hierarchy. People were assassinated, as you said previously. There were assassinations that were committed. Soviets sent their KGB out in the 50s, you know, in the 40s it was the NKVD, to hit people who might be a threat at some point, might be revealed as agents. I mean, when you think about it, Tom, all of this played out against Kimmel. I'm talking about your grandfather now. I'm talking about husband E. Kimmel at a time in his life when he was dedicated to serving America. He was out there in the Pacific, and yet he was basically totally in the dark. I can't help but come back to that point.
Well, it's hard to reconcile, but it does explain why the administration is not particularly keen on getting back into the Kimmel case, into the Kimmel matter, because now the Kimmel matter incorporates all of these errors that are so glaringly obvious now from information that has come to light subsequent to Admiral Kimmel's death. A pretty good example of that. Let's talk about Oleg Gordievsky. Gordievsky was a recruitment in place, the holy grail of the intelligence industry. In other words, you've developed a spy. He's agreed to stay in his position and tell you what's going on. That's what Gordievsky did. He was the number 2 man in the establishment in London. So for 10 years, he is keeping us apprised of what the Soviets are doing there. Marvelous spy for us. He originally tried to spy for CIA, volunteer spy. CIA didn't trust him, kicked him out. So he went to the Brits, volunteered for them, and they agreed, okay, we'll pay you money and you stay in place and tell us what's going on. And he did for quite a while. Eventually, the Soviets figured him out and arrested him. He was exfiltrated from the Soviet Union. Still the Soviet Union at that time, in a marvelous James Bond kind of operation, which still remains highly classified, how they exfiltrated him. Exfiltration is a made-up word, meaning getting him out of a hostile territory without the enemy knowing that you've done it. Mm-hmm. Anyway, they did that. And they got Gordievsky in this country. Now Gordievsky is telling his story. Gordievsky tells this marvelous story that involves Pearl Harbor. Well, how can that be? Because he's a relatively young spy. He wasn't alive during that time. Well, he tells the story of going back to Moscow Center for training as a spy. The instructor is none other than Akhmerov, Ishak Akhmerov, the guy who developed Harry Dexter White and all of these other spies in the 1930s.
Wow.
And of course, this is the grand old man of Soviet intelligence, and all these young officers, now KGB officers, to include Gordievsky, they're all in awe of this walking legend of Soviet intelligence. And Gordievsky is holding forth, and he surprises, Akhmerov is holding forth, and Gordievsky is sitting there in awe of this great man. Akhmerov says, the most important of all wartime agents in the United States was, and of course they were expecting him to say Harry Dexter White or Blanchard Curie, and he says Harry Hopkins. And everybody's jaw dropped because Harry Hopkins, they all knew, was the #1 confidant of President Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. How can this possibly be? Now we do have a Venona intercept that refers to an Agent 19. The American intelligence officers that were working on the problem at the time put a little note on there speculating that Agent 19 was Harry Hopkins. But there are other authorities on the subject that are in disarray, don't necessarily agree that Harry Hopkins was a spy. And it's interesting how they line up. Gordievsky, of course, gives the most compelling information, which he says came from Akhmerov himself. Akhmerov didn't say Harry Hopkins was a spy. He said he was the most important of all sorts of Soviet wartime agents in the United States. What exactly does that mean? Well, Nigel West, unofficial historian for MI5, he doesn't think that the evidence is convincing that Harry Hopkins was a spy. Christopher Andrew, who is the Cambridge professor who writes with and for Gordievsky, wrote the history with Gordievsky, he didn't think there was enough to call Hopkins a Soviet spy. He thought there was only enough to call him an unwitting dupe of the Soviets.
Could we use the word asset instead? A Soviet asset?
Well, apparently Akhmerov himself used Soviet wartime agent. And there are others. An official historian for NSA thinks the evidence indicates that most probably, quote unquote, Hopkins was a spy. a fellow by the name of Romerstein, who served on the House American Unactivities Committee as an investigator for years and years.
I remember the name. Yeah.
He suggests that Hopkins was definitely a spy. The Oracle, Ann Coulter, she's writing that he was definitely a spy. It's interesting.
Again, this is the same Harry Hopkins who the quote was attributed to, who said you can elect and elect, tax and tax, spend and spend. The American people are too damn dumb to understand.
Well, trying to get it back to Pearl Harbor now, recall that the night before Pearl Harbor, the 13th part of the 14th part response to the American note of November 26 comes in. Lester Schultz, the courier for the Navy, Lieutenant Commander Lester Schultz, gives the 13th part to President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt, this means war, hands it to Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins is not on the list of people cleared to see magic, purple, but of course nobody's going to worry too much about that, simply because this is the President of the United States and he can clear anybody he wants to. He hands it to Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins says, hey, I agree, this means war. And there you are. Well, if he was a Soviet spy, clearly that information is going right back to Moscow Center. At any rate, you can speculate about Harry Hopkins until you're blue in the face. What is interesting, it comes from Ann Coulter, is her efforts to try and compare the George W. Bush, that's Bush 43 administration, with the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration. And he tries to give, Ann Coulter tries to give her readership a feel for how penetrated, this is all hypothetical now, how penetrated the George Bush administration would have had to have been to equal the penetrations that were proven through Venona of the Roosevelt administration. So, first of all, Henry Wallace is the vice president. Through Venona, you can make a case that Henry Wallace was an unwitting dupe of the Soviets at the very least, if not a spy. You now have and that would, of course, equate to Dick Cheney. Then you have Paul Wolfowitz, who was one of the Defense Department assistants of the president. She compares him to Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White. And you have Andrew Card. Remember Andrew Card?
Certainly.
That would be compared to Launchlin Curie, all right? And then you had Karl Rove. He would be compared to Harry Hopkins. And then you had George Tenet.
A lot of similarities.
Well, this is the one that's very interesting to me because we knew that the number 2 man in the OSS, read the CIA, number 2 man is a Soviet spy, Duncan Lee. So you'd have to compare him to George Tenet. And then he goes on to Owen Lattimore and
now that's
Ickes.
something you just touched on now that opens up another Pandora's box, and that is we were told by many in the field of research, and maybe it comes out in the book Treachery, 6 Decades of Soviet Espionage in Britain and the United States. Recently, within the last year, it was published. Who was the author of that?
Chapman Pincher was the author who had, in the 1980s, had written the first effort at that called Their Trade is Treachery, where he's trying to demonstrate that the head of MI5, read the British FBI, he's trying to make a case that the head of MI5 for years and years was a Soviet agent.
And finally?
The matter's still in dispute. So
Okay, now let me ask you this. Now, because of that, many have looked into the OSS and how the OSS evolved into what became known as the CIA. You pointed out one Soviet agent. There were several others, I believe at least 2 other KGB people, Soviet agents, who were instrumental in laying the foundation for what would become the Central Intelligence Agency, from what I've read. Now, have you delved into this as well?
Well, I have indeed, and the Soviets were remarkably successful at penetrating the Office of Strategic Services. The numbers of confirmed Soviet agents in the Office of Strategic Services varies anywhere from a dozen to 2 or 3 dozen. And
Weren't
of course,
they
the number two guy definitely was Duncan Lee. He was the number two guy in the Office of Strategic Services.
And weren't they also involved heavily in all of this rewriting of the history to favor the victors in the Soviet Union regarding World War II and many of the claims that were made?
I'm not well versed in that arena.
One area has to do with, for instance, the Katyn Forest Massacre in Poland that took place, and it took a former governor of Massachusetts, Fercolo, I believe, Peter Fercolo, who wrote the book, The Katyn Forest Massacre.
Yeah.
Well, OSS apparently so infiltrated by the Soviets because of this collaboration in World War II, and that they actually rewrote so much of the history that we call history today regarding World War II, and now we're starting to go back, independent people looking at it and saying, well, this wasn't true, that wasn't true. It wasn't the German army that went into Katyn and committed the massacres. It was the Soviet army, rather, that went in and committed those atrocities.
Yeah,
the cream of the crop of Poland.
It takes a long time for the truth to finally come forward.
Certainly does.
Back to this area of Soviet penetration. In the UK, of course, they were marvelously successful at penetrating the establishment in the UK.
Okay.
The Philby, Maclean, Burgess, Charing Cross, the Cambridge Five, and all of that. They did a marvelous job there, but that also directly relates to Pearl Harbor and the Japanese codes. And I love to tell this story because I only found out about it in 2005, later than that. It was only available in 2005. I found out about it a couple of years later.
Wow.
And that is a result, again, of this former director of British counterintelligence for the working against the Soviets, Guy Liddell, in his diary. In his diary, now this is prior to Pearl Harbor now, he has a diary entry of August 14th, 1941. August 14th, 1941, so months before Pearl Harbor. Guy Liddell, the director of counterintelligence for MI5, writes in his diary, we, in MI5 counterintelligence, discuss the question of BJs. Again, this is Soviet, this is UK jargon for Japanese communications, intelligence. BJs, black jumbos, magic, that's what we're talking about here. He goes on to write in his diary, I, Guy Liddell, tried to press home my point that it was essential for us in MI5 to have as much information as we could obtain. Obvious. Black jumbos, magic, were especially valuable since there the Japanese expressed their innermost thoughts and thought it was secret. It was for this reason that I, Guy Liddell, the director of counterintelligence for MI5, had suggested that Anthony Blunt, an officer working for MI5, should go down periodically to the Government Code and Cipher School, the British NSA,
National Security Agency.
And make notes. Make notes. This is in August, before Pearl Harbor. So Anthony Blunt, a Soviet spy, is making notes about the British breaking of Japanese codes prior to Pearl Harbor. It doesn't take a whole lot to assume here that Anthony Blunt made it well known that the British and the Americans were breaking the Soviet codes prior to Pearl Harbor. And yet that information remained completely secret until this exposure of this diary in 2005.
Could we deduce from that the administration was fully aware of these revelations or not? In Britain, that is.
Somewhere along the line, the UK apparently got some advanced information about the attack on Pearl Harbor. At least if we are going to believe the head of the Joint Intelligence Committee, Victor Cavendish Bentinck, and his associate, Sir Julian Rigsdale, and the Prime Minister of Canada and his air officer. We've got, can't quite remember their names now, and of course we also have the secretary of Sir William Stevenson, who is the man called Intrepid. We have some indications of advanced knowledge. Now, is it proof positive? No. Is it compelling? To some. Is it a smoking gun? Not quite. But it's certainly an indication that there was advanced knowledge. And of course, having Anthony Blunt go down there and take information prior to Pearl Harbor about Japanese codes, when Admiral Kimmel, the guy most in need of this information, has no idea that there is such a thing. I have a personal experience from my time in the FBI, which is pertinent to this discussion. Sure. We had a spy when I was the assistant agent in charge of the FBI in Philadelphia that we had located in Philadelphia, Minersville, as I recall, a very small town outside of Philadelphia. The spy was identified to us because Vasily Matroikin, who was an archivist at Moscow Center for the KGB.
The archives, yes.
He was in the archives for years and years and years, worried that the KGB was, that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, which it did. He was preparing for the day when it did collapse, so he kept purloining, stealing documents out of the Soviet archives of the KGB, squirreling them away for a rainy day. The rainy day came. He defects with all of his material that he has managed to squirrel out of the Soviet archives. In part of that material is the identification of this spy that we were working in the 1990s. His name was Robert Lipka. Robert Lipka now is a fairly older fellow, but when he was a young enlisted Army sergeant, he was at NSA stealing NSA documents and giving it to the Soviets, specifically giving it to a couple of Soviet illegals that were visiting Minersville, Pennsylvania. Well, Minersville, Pennsylvania is just a big nothing. We in the FBI knew that these two Soviet illegals were traveling from New York City to Minersville, Pennsylvania, but that's all we knew. But what was driving us crazy is we couldn't figure out why these illegals were coming to Minersville, Pennsylvania. This is in the 1960s. We don't find out until the 1990s when Matroikin comes out, identifies who this guy was, who's living in Minersville. Well, of course, now we know who this guy is. Well, it's one thing to know who he is, another thing to be able to convict him of espionage. There's a long, wonderful story which is going to be turned into a book, not by me, but by a colleague, on how they actually made the case. And it's a real tribute to the FBI and to the agents that worked the matter.
Well, you will be in that book, I presume?
Maybe as a footnote, that'd be it.
That's all right.
But here's the part that applies to Pearl Harbor.
Sure.
Matroikin also comes out with the information saying that prior to Pearl Harbor, the Soviets had broken purple. Okay? And that's all. That's all he says. But then again, with the Anthony Blunt information.
To sum it all up, I mean, just this point, what you're saying is essentially you've got enough variable evidence, enough statements from different people, from different quarters, from Soviets themselves, the Monona, all of these others that definitely would indicate clearly that Pearl Harbor was indeed planned, an event that was anticipated at the very least on the part of this administration, Roosevelt administration, and again, whose purpose did it serve? Cui bono? You asked the question.
Sui bono.
It certainly did, sui bono. It definitely served the interest, ultimately, of the Soviet Union, who was ultimately the real winner in World War II, and not only in Europe, but in Asia. You know, people talk about how, well, Japan was at least liberated from a military regime, a dictatorship, into a, quote, democracy. And they always overlook the one little minor footnote in history, and that is that Communist China became Communist China in 1949, and General Marshall, again, that name with the photographic memory, General C. Marshall, came up with a plan, essentially, which disarmed Chiang Kai-shek, because he wouldn't go into a coalition government with the communists. So these agrarian reformers, as they were called, Mao and his gang, managed to take mainland China, turn it into the most ruthless communist dictatorship on the face of the earth, paling even Stalin by comparison. I mean, what was it, 70 million were supposed to have been killed under Mao Zedong and his gang that were called agrarian reformers?
Yeah. pick a number. I don't know, you're getting out of my area
But
again.
no, but this is in your area because it is a matter of record now. It's history, and you are a historian, and I know that you know, as well as all of us do, that we didn't defeat tyranny in Asia by defeating Japan. We, in fact, actually created a new tyranny, and that was the Bolshevik communists and then the so-called split of Red China from the Soviet Union. But we saw that the greatest dictatorship of all would then be created, and now where is Red China today in terms of the United States?
Well, I still hearken back to Admiral Kimmel making that radio interview and saying that the Soviets still posed a threat to the Japanese, so the Japanese aren't going to attack the United States as long as the Soviets pose that threat. But we have purple intercepts at the time, of course Admiral Kimmel didn't get them, saying such things as, right now we in Japan, this is coming from the Foreign Office in Japan in Tokyo, sending it to the ambassadors in Washington, D.C., the Japanese ambassadors, saying, this is back in November of 1941, saying right now we in Japan, it is to our advantage to stress the South. And for the time being, we would prefer to refrain from any direct moves in the North. In other words, Russia. And of course, they continue with that with yet another purple intercept that Kimmel didn't get, which is more instructions from Togo at the Japanese Foreign Office in Tokyo to the ambassadors in Washington, D.C., and other places, saying that great care shall be exercised not to antagonize Russia, making it abundantly clear that it is not in Japan's plans to make any moves towards the North, towards Russia. And yet, again, this information is withheld, not only from Kimmel, but from the Coordinator of Information, Wild Bill Donovan, and from the FBI.
It is amazing. It's an amazing story of duplicity, treachery, as we pointed out, treason within the government of the United States, and how many lives have been lost because of it, ruined. We saw what happened with Kimmel, and we saw what happened with Short, and we've seen what happened with others along the way in other wars that also wanted to win and wanted to do their job, and how they were frustrated by politicians and administrations and Korea and Vietnam. Now, you were in Vietnam, and you were on three battleships, I guess. Is that right?
3 warships, yeah. 2 destroyers and an LST, yeah.
Now, how involved were you personally, Tom, in that particular war in Vietnam?
Well, I was in the Navy. We provided gunfire support to our troops in Vietnam along the demilitarized zone. When I was on the LST, I was the first lieutenant, and we picked up a mechanized battalion of Marines in Da Nang along the pier there, and brought them back to the United States. I still recall, there was nothing heroic involved in any of this, Rick, I assure you. My most memorable moment was being on the pier in Da Nang when I suddenly heard the rat-a-tat-tat of an I'm not sure if it was an M1 or an M14, I can't remember the number back in those days, and I thought this could be the end. Well, as it turned out, it was nothing more than one of our Marine sentries firing rounds into the river, into the Saigon River, to discourage sappers. Remember that term, sappers?
Yes.
But it certainly got my attention at the time, and of course I was in charge of loading the Marines onto the LST.
So now, you and your family, I guess it's hard to find anybody in the history going back of your particular lineage that has not been in some conflict, some war, some effort, going back, as we said originally on the previous documentary and this one, going back to pre-revolutionary times. How far back do you go now, 1590s or something?
Well, 1591, we have the family crest from Johann Michael Kimmel, who somehow was associated with the Polish cavalry. We have a marvelous portraiture of him wearing a turban, of all things, so there you go.
This is amazing, amazing history. Have we left anything out now of this discussion of treachery, of Soviet penetration in World War II, the FDR administration, Harry Hopkins, Harry Dexter White, that we should bring to our audience today pertaining to this era and how it relates to Pearl Harbor?
Well, one thing that I had forgotten that I would love to get on the record is
Sure.
I went to great detail to talk about Army Chief of Staff Marshall and his dissembling at the Roberts Commission, at the Naval Court of Inquiry, at the Army Pearl Harbor Board, and at the Joint Congressional Committee, especially at the Joint Congressional Committee, where he just wasn't able to recall anything in spite of the photographic memory. But I should talk about his counterpart, the head of the Navy, Admiral Stark. Admiral Stark, and this is not a bad story. Admiral Stark was interrogated by Senator Homer Ferguson again, under oath before the Joint Congressional Committee.
Yes.
And Homer Ferguson goes to great length to try and elicit from Chief of Naval Operations Stark that Chief of Naval Operations Stark has had every opportunity to provide all the information which is relevant and material to the Joint Congressional Committee's investigation, and gets him to have to admit that he had been treated fairly by the committee and that he had had plenty of time to think about what might be available to the committee, what would again be pertinent to the committee's effort. After going through a page and a half of testimony eliciting this, Stark says, yes, indeed, you've given me every opportunity, and that pretty much ends it. This is in January of 1946. So, I guess it's about 3 months later, the Joint Congressional Committee's proceedings are over, and they shut down. The Joint Congressional Committee investigation is officially closed.
Yes.
A week later, Admiral Stark's flag lieutenant, Captain Crick, comes to Admiral Stark and says, Admiral Stark, they asked you where you were the night before Pearl Harbor, and you said you couldn't remember. And Homer Ferguson made you say that 6 times, that you couldn't remember where you were the night before Pearl Harbor when the president got the famous message and said, this means war. Well, don't you recall, Admiral Stark, you were with me, Captain Crick, with me and my wife, you and your wife. We went to the National Theater. After the National Theater, we went back to your residence. You got a call from the President of the United States that night. You just excused yourself, went and took the call, came back and told us that the President of the United States was discussing with you the critical situation in the Pacific. Don't you recall that, Admiral Stark? With this information, Stark realized he's between the devil and the deep blue sea. Goes back to the chairman of the committee, tells him the story. They now reconvene the Joint Congressional Committee to tell this story. And Stark and Crick comes in there and he lays it all out, and Homer Ferguson, or the chairman of the committee, says, how come you, Captain Crick, remember this and Admiral Stark does not? And Captain Crick says, you just don't forget that sort of thing under that circumstance. So now they put Admiral Stark back on the stand, and they ask him this all again. And Stark says, gee, notwithstanding my flag lieutenant's attempt to refresh my recollection, I still don't recall where I was the night before Pearl Harbor. I think he joined the ranks of General Marshall in the grossest of dissembling. One more footnote to that. In 1981, the Chief of Naval Personnel, when I was a midshipman at the Naval Academy, Admiral Smedberg, writes a reminiscence for the Naval Institute of Proceedings, in which he describes his time as a naval aide to Admiral Stark prior to Pearl Harbor. There were 3 naval aides, actually, Wellborn, Smedberg, and another one I can't think of at the moment. Smedberg describes how President Roosevelt would call up Chief of Naval Operations Stark and give him rapid-fire orders, do this, that, and the other thing. And they couldn't keep them all straight. They tried to write them down, but they couldn't write fast enough. So Smedberg, the aide, decides, well, what we'll do to overcome this is we will, in effect, put a wiretap on Chief of Naval Operations Stark's telephone, which in effect was a wiretap on the incoming calls of President Roosevelt. And as it turned out, the incoming call from Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State.
Yes, yes.
And of course, the famous call was Cordell Hull, after he had made the decision not to give the 3-month delay modus vivendi to the Japanese, but to go ahead and give the Harry Dexter White ultimatum to the Japanese, the document that touched the button to start the war. And he called up Stark, the Secretary of State, and said he'd done this. Well, Stark was asked on the stand if he even knew that the ultimatum had been sent. Stark said he had no knowledge of the ultimatum whatsoever. And of course, he was given every opportunity to provide information to the committee that had not been elicited by the questions. You know, the famous pervasive question at the end, which any prosecutor should do. If you know of anything, Mr. Witness, that would be relevant and pertinent to this investigation that has not been drawn out by the questions asked, now is your opportunity to volunteer this information, which of course is relevant and pertinent to what we're trying to do here. And what we're trying to do here is to try and figure out how it was possible for a Pearl Harbor to occur. Well, do you think it might have been pertinent to say that we had a wiretap on the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, in effect, because we were monitoring and recording the telephone calls on Stark's phone?
Yes.
Stark makes no mention of this.
No mention.
Smedberg testifies, makes no mention of this. Another aide who clearly must have known about this, I mean, you can't very well have this tech going on and not knowing it. He testified, he didn't make any mention of it, and there you go.
Unreal. Again, I mean, I think we're all probably just stunted here in terms of the information you have given, the fact that you are basically a walking, talking encyclopedia of knowledge pertaining to the Pearl Harbor story, being a historian in this field. Obviously, you had a family interest first and foremost, but beyond all of that, you have an interest professionally, being an investigator, having done all of this work for the FBI. I just, on a personal note, we've never really talked about your dad, your father. I'm talking about Kimmel's son.
Sure.
What was he doing during these years?
He was a Naval Academy graduate in 1936. He spent a career in submarines. He was the commanding officer of 4 or 5 ships. During World War II, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, he was in Manila Bay on the submarine S-40. He was the number 3 officer on board. The habitability of S-40, one of the old boats, the S-boats they called them, was so bad that when you were in port, you didn't even think about staying on the boat. You needed relief because that was such a rigorous exercise to be on that boat. You stayed in the officers' quarters or the barracks. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he was asleep in the officers' quarters, the bachelor officers' quarters in Manila. He woke up 4 hours after the attack, 6 a.m., woke up routinely, went down to the lobby of the bachelor officers' quarters, and there was a note pinned to the bulletin board. It said, "Pearl Harbor had been attacked, conduct yourselves accordingly." Of course, he didn't believe it. And then he didn't really know what in the world conduct yourself accordingly meant. So he figured maybe I better get back to the submarine. So he goes back to the submarine. In Manila Bay, there are 26 submarines. Admiral Hart didn't really have a fleet that amounted to a hill of beans, with one huge exception. He had some of the finest submarines in the United States Navy. He had 29 submarines. 26 of those submarines, including my dad's S-40, was in Manila Bay, anchored alongside the pier or alongside the submarine tender with no special instructions, no special precautions. If the Japanese had attacked those 26 submarines in Manila Bay with no special instructions, no special precautions, if they had attacked those 26 submarines there instead of the 8 battleships at Pearl Harbor, they would have advanced their war effort by an order of magnitude. I take this speculation from none other than Prime Minister Tojo, who said at his war crime trial in Tokyo, before we hung him, he was asked the question, why do you, Prime Minister Tojo, think you lost the war? And he said 3 reasons, in no particular order. 1, the island hopping tactics of the Allies. In other words, leaving great chunks of the Japanese army on an island to fend for itself with no means of supply. There was no means of supply because the submarines, which was item number 2, had sunk everything in sight and they couldn't supply the Japanese on these islands. The Japanese on the islands were not a threat. They just left them there and went on and attacked some other position. Those were 2 of the reasons. The other was the fast carrier attack tactics of the Allies, those 3 reasons. Again, in no particular priority order. Over half of all the ships that were sunk in World War II of the Japanese were sunk by American submarines. A huge number of Japanese warships were sunk by American submarines. The submarine force took second seat to no other force as far as winning the war. They were that important. And this is Tojo himself saying that. This is all by way of saying that attacking those submarines would have been vastly more productive for the Japanese war effort than attacking the battleships. At Pearl Harbor, there were 5 submarines, and none of them were attacked, amazingly enough. They would have advanced their war effort better if they had attacked the 5 submarines and left the battleships to themselves. And this answers the question, what was my dad doing?
Yes.
He was barely surviving on S-40, because in March, right after Pearl Harbor, he is engaged in the Battle of Lingayen Gulf, which is a famous naval action, desperate naval action, where virtually no damage was inflicted, except the Japanese almost sunk, and they did sink a couple of submarines, but almost sank my dad's submarine, but he survived.
Almost, and your father a miracle survivor, and you and your grandfather, were there any casualties in the war in your family?
Indeed, Admiral Kimmel had 3 sons. The oldest of the 3, Manning Kimmel, named after the Confederate War participant, I won't call him a hero, participant. He was the commanding officer of the submarine Robolo, which was out. This was his 3rd submarine during the war. He had been on 2 other submarines, sinking everything in sight, I might add, escaping miraculously, one hair-raising event after another. Specifically, he was on a submarine that was fired on by another submarine. The famous Lapon versus Rayton event, where it's the only documented example of an American submarine firing on another American submarine. Lapon fired on my uncle's submarine Rayton. The torpedoes hit the side of the hull, but because our torpedoes were so ineffective in the early part of the war, the torpedo didn't go off, or my uncle would have been killed in the early part of the war instead of being killed in the latter part of the war.
Goodness.
When his 3rd submarine, Robolo, he was the commanding officer of it, we think ran into a mine and was lost with all hands. The reason I say we think is because there are other stories that are associated with it. Nothing was ever recovered, nothing from the submarine, no personnel were recovered, but there was a prisoner of war report that some people from Robolo escaped and managed to swim ashore, which did happen on a couple of other submarines, documented. In this case, it's not documented, it's just rumored, and one of them supposedly was my uncle. After the bombing of Rabaul, the Japanese went into a frenzy, so goes the story, threw the prisoners, my uncle and others from the submarine, threw them into a pit, doused them with gasoline and put them on fire.
My goodness.
Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I suspect that it's not true, but I just don't know. But I can certainly lead you to the documentation where those stories are believed, at any rate.
Well, it's great to have you here on this special documentary program, and you can leave us with an oral rendition now of your website for people who'd like to know more information. Again, it's a non-commercial website. It's informational. People who have questions can contact you through the website as well, can't they?
I would certainly encourage anyone that would like to know more about this story, and there's a lot more to be known, and there'll be a lot more coming forward in the near future, including articles that I have written that at the moment I'm reluctant to reveal because of some proprietary interest by the publishers, but that information will eventually be available on my website, and if you specifically want a copy of it, you can go to my website, which is www.pearlharbor911attacks, plural, attacks.com, pearlharbor911attacks.com. And if you want to send me an email, make a specific request for this kind of material, I'll be delighted to comply. My email is tkimmel, that's Tango Kimmel, Kimmel, tkimmel @CFL for Central Florida, .rr for roadrunner.com, tkimmel @CFL.rr.com. And look forward to hearing from you.
Been my
Thank you
pleasure
very
to
much.
have you, Tom Kimmel, here on the programs that we've done, and we definitely wish you Godspeed in your continued pursuit of truth and justice and the American way.
Well, with your help, it will be continued. So thank you very
Amen.
much, Rick.
Amen. Thank you all for joining us on this special. In summary, the Japanese tried at all costs to avoid any attack on the United States, even after it was official U.S. policy to goad both Japan and Germany into open hostilities. That Washington had developed a secret decoding machine known as MAGIC, and that top officials of the Roosevelt administration knew the exact time and location of the Pearl Harbor attack, including the president himself. The Soviet communist dictatorship of Joe Stalin had severely penetrated the innermost elements of Washington, as revealed in the release of the Venona intercepts. As a result of this enormous infiltration of the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, the Soviet Union claimed a victory in World War II, as it swept across more than a dozen nations, and leading to the rape of Manchuria, the enslavement in mainland China, Korea, and the subsequent cat and mouse farce of fighting communism throughout most of the world for decades. And finally, General George Patton knew that the United States had sold out to Red Russia, and he vowed to come home and resign from the U.S. military, threatening to spill the beans. He died, however, in a hospital after an automobile crash which many felt was intended as an assassination.